every woman who is around 30 years of the age must go for the screening for cervical cancer.
Can fertility be preserved in uterine or cervical cancer?
That can be done only when the disease is confined to that particular organ.
Not having children increases the risk of gynae cancers.
Yes.
Pap smear detects all gynae cancers.
No.
Obesity increases the risk of gynae cancers.
Yes.
HPV vaccine 100% prevents cervical cancer.
Yes. The incidence of the gynecological cancer is really increasing in the younger women.
Is it true that multiple C-sections can cause such cancers? Hello everyone and a very warm welcome to the 12th episode of Conversations with Xyla. I'm Khushbu Agarwal, the founder at Xyla Health, and it's my pleasure to host today with us a very senior doctor, Dr. Rama Joshi, on Conversations with Xyla. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Today we are hosting you with a very bold topic indeed. It's called Period, Pads and Partners, What Really Causes Female Gynae Cancers? And the relevance of this topic, June is celebrated every year as the Uterine Cancer Month. Very relevant and important given that in India alone, we are seeing over 2 lakh plus cases of gynae cancers, including uterine cancers and other cancers such as ovarian, cervical, and others. Today, we have the privilege of answering very critical questions on female gynae cancers and also busting important myths with Dr. Rama Joshi, Chairman, Gynae Oncology and Robotic Surgery at Fortis Cancer Institute, FMRI, Gurgaon. Dr. Joshi has a rich experience of more than 3 decades in treating women's cancers. She completed her MBBS with a gold medal and MS as well as fellow gynae onco from Tata Memorial Hospital, Mumbai. Dr. Joshi has also specialized in UICC fellowship from New York, USA, and she is known for her deep expertise in robotic surgery, having performed over 10,000 plus surgeries and saved multiple lives for women fighting with uterine, ovarian, cervical, and other gynae cancers. Dr. Joshi is an expert in minimally invasive and robotic-assisted surgeries, also certified in robotic surgery from the USA. What a pleasure to be hosting you today, ma'am. Thank you so much for making the time for us.
Thank you.
So, ma'am, before we start, I wanted to uncover this entire mystery of gynae cancers. What are really gynae cancers and what really, is the definition of gynecological cancers?
When cancer begins in the reproductive organs, say for an example, the cervix, it is known as cervical cancer. The uterus, that is the uterine cancer. When it begins in the ovaries is the ovarian cancer. In vagina is vaginal cancers and vulva is vulvar cancer. So basically, these are the cancers of the reproductive organs of the woman. These are the gynecological cancers.
Great. So we're covering most of the common female cancers other than breast cancer today is basically what we can say. So Dr. Joshi, before we start, we have a tradition here at Conversations with Xyla that we start with a rapid fire round. It helps us bust common myths of critical topics. So are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So the first question is, irregular periods can be a sign of cancer.
Very much.
Certain sanitary pads can cause gynecological cancers.
No.
Not having children increases the risk of gynae cancers.
Yes.
Having multiple sexual partners can increase the risk of gynae cancers.
Yes.
Okay. Obesity increases the risk of gynae cancers.
Yes.
Pap smear detects all gynae cancers.
No.
HPV vaccine 100% prevents cervical cancer.
Yes.
Fertility can be preserved in early uterine cancer.
Yes, it can be. But if I can add, in selected cases.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am, for busting those critical myths. And there are a lot of mysteries and myths floating on social media all the time. It is our pleasure to be hearing from an expert today, so we know exactly what is correct and the right information is disseminated to our audience. To our amazing audience, thank you so much for dialing in. I would appreciate if you could pose any of your questions in the chat section. We will be taking them as and when with Dr. Joshi so that she can address all your queries. Great. So, ma'am, moving on to the next segment now, we wanted to talk about the risk factors and causes. As we were just discussing before we started, you were mentioning that now, in your 3 decades of experience compared to the earlier time, you're seeing many younger women pose with cancer diagnosis and walk up to you for treatment. So, are you seeing this trend lately? What is really the cause of such cancers in younger women, ma'am?
Yeah, so far as my experience goes, I think you have asked me two questions. One is what are the risk factors, right? And the other one is about the young.
Yes.
In my practice, what I have observed is that yes, the incidence of the gynecological cancer is really increasing in the younger women. And in the young girls, if suppose I say so. So majority of the young girls, they do suffer with that of the very early cervical cancer and also even the uterine cancers. Uterine cancer incidence, uterine cancer is the cancer which is usually the cancer of the postmenopausal age group. But we do see even in the younger girls or younger women, I mean to say late 20s and early 30s. And this is mainly because of certain conditions like polycystic ovarian disease, which increases the incidence of uterine cancer threefold in comparison to the otherwise the normal young girls and the normal young women. So most of the time, these are usually diagnosed at the time when they are seeking the, you can say the consultation for the fertility. And on endometrial biopsy, the diagnosis of endometrial cancer is made. So this is one example. On the other side, even the ovarian cancers, I think they are also comparatively on the rise so far as in the younger age group of the women, where I think there are a lot of issues related with that of, the quality of life. Because I think you will agree with me that any kind of the diagnosis of the gynecological cancers, and that too in a young, this really actually bothers a lot so far as the psychological impact on the patient herself. And naturally, there are a lot of concerns and the issues related with that of the fertility and also the sexual health. And also one is looking into the good survival as well as the quality of life. That's how these are the challenges we come across when we diagnose these cancers among the young women.
Right. And ma'am, what could be the cause of this increase in cancers in young women?
I think overall, every cancer has a different, you can say, the risk factors. Like cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is the one which is caused by the oncogenic HPV virus, which is a sexually transmitted infection. So HPV, along with that of the other factors, like that of the smoking, like having multiple sexual partners. So these are all the risks which increases. And maybe that we are observing these days a lot of change into the socio-cultural behavior. Maybe that is responsible for the increasing incidence of the cervical cancer among the young.
Mm-hmm. So, ma'am, if we had to rank the risk factors, you mentioned certain lifestyle factors, you mentioned certain behavioral factors such as multiple sexual partners. Earlier, you were also mentioning things like PCOS, PCOD. So, what is usually the most common risk factor that you've seen?
The other risk factors, I think, which I did not mention about, these are the lifestyle, as you said. I think this is the obesity. Increasing incidence of the obesity, and also you can say the comorbid conditions like that of the hypertension and also the diabetes among the women. These are on the rise. And these are to be taken as the risk factors for especially like that of the uterine cancers and also of the ovarian cancers. And the increase in the risk may be 2 to 3 or maybe 4-fold based on these risk factors. That's how the lifestyle also makes a difference actually in increasing the incidence of these cancers.
Got it. And ma'am, given our audience, number of them may have faced weight issues, obesity or PCOS before. What is really the link between these two and these gynecological cancers? How are they really linked?
Yeah, they are very much linked. As I said, obesity that increases the estrogen exposure of the woman. And we have certain cancers like that of the uterine cancer, which increases with the obesity, and also the ovarian cancer. These are hormone dependent cancers. That is how the incidence is increased. And if suppose the one is looking into the good lifestyle and of course looking at carrying her, the healthy weight, then we can reduce the risk, for these cancers.
Got it. Great. Ma'am, is stress a causative factor also? If someone is in deep stress over years, does that impact the diagnosis or the risk factor for cancer?
I think that stress is concerned over the period of years, what you are mentioning about. Of course, it has been correlated with that of the increased risk, but it is not very well established. But definitely the increased stress, especially in the woman who has been diagnosed of the gynecological cancers, has been correlated well with that of the comparatively poor prognosis. And this is mainly because of the secretion of these stress hormones. And that's how that makes an impact on the prognosis of these cancers.
Got it. Great. So, Dr. Joshi, we'll just touch upon one last piece on the risk factor side before we move on. And that is a very critical part with respect to changes in lifestyle, right? So, diet, alcohol, smoking, you mentioned these are risk factors. I want to just touch upon this topic. How is it related? And we see a lot of rise in these evils in tier 1 cities in India. What is the correlation with these gynecological cancers?
The diet can be correlated well, because if suppose anybody is going to be obese, of course we do understand the type of the diet one is really consuming. So any kind of the diet should be healthy if it is fiber rich, and of course this is having comparatively the less of the saturated fats, and fruits, vegetables. Actually, one should really consume good amount of the colored fruits and the vegetables and the fibers. Less of the sugars, and also one should really be avoiding most of the time, the processed food. And also some kind of the red meat and all. These are not considered to be the good in the diet. So once we know what is healthy diet, and we really actually abide by those, whatever the way what you are eating today is really good for your health, so that the obesity can be, reduced, or the obesity can be avoided. So naturally it's going to be a healthy weight, and once it is the healthy weight, we can prevent the number of the diseases, not only even the cancers. In the cancers, as I said, that the uterine cancers, ovarian cancers, and the breast cancers. That's how actually we can look at. But we also can reduce the other lifestyle diseases, like say the diabetes, the hypertension. All these kind of things are also interrelated with that of the obesity.
Got it. Great. And ma'am, is it also possible that given earlier women were not so subjected to alcohol and smoking, we did not see cancers in the young women, and now given that trend, that has also increased?
So let me tell you, so far as the population based cancer registry in India, that is showing, I must say, 2 decades earlier, this is how we could find that there is an increase in the risk of, say, uterine cancer in this country. Uterine cancer is the disease of the West and Western world. But now, because of the changes in the lifestyle itself, increased consumption of the alcohol, as well as the fast food, as well as you can say the processed food. That's how we are looking into the rise in the obesity, and now many of the women, they are suffering from the uterine cancer. So uterine cancer is also on the rise in this country because of the lifestyle changes.
Makes sense. So small lifestyle changes can go a long way in preventing these serious diseases. Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. Now, just coming to the next aspect, Dr. Joshi, of screening, right? So given a lot of these diseases may not come up with severe symptoms all the time. What are the screening guidelines? Who should get screened and at what age? How frequently?
So screening, let me tell you what is screening. When woman feels absolutely healthy and good, she doesn't have any of the symptoms. This is where if we can pick up either any of the cancer in its very early stage or in its precancerous stage, that is known as the screening. And some screening tests, of course, it is very well established for the cervical cancer. We can have the screening test of the PEP test, or which is commonly known as pap smear, along with that of the HPV DNA. So if we do HPV DNA testing and the PEP test, we can combine them at the regular interval so that we can pick up this particular cervical cancer in its precancerous condition or in very early cervical cancer stage, where these cancers can be treated, I mean to say, with a very good success. And in the sense, if suppose I tell you the survival of the very early cervical cancer approaches more than 97%. Similarly, we cannot screen with the help of the PEP test the other cancers, like that of the uterine cancers. Uterine cancer can be screened by, of course, the annual health checks. And in that, one can include the transvaginal ultrasound in addition to that of the abdominal ultrasound. When the patient is not, or the woman is not having any of the symptoms, it is the lining of the endometrium. Endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus, actually, which bleeds during the period. So we can measure the thickness of this lining in order to see whether it is abnormal, it is really growing more than that of the normal, so that we can pick up the endometrial cancer on the biopsy when we find that the thickness is abnormal. So that's how we can pick up the endometrial cancer in its early stage. Similarly, it's really a dilemma, rather it's a challenge for us to pick up the ovarian cancer early. You must have heard that majority of the ovarian cancers, when they are diagnosed, they are already in their advanced stages. At the time when they are in either stage 3, that means there is a spread of the ovarian cancer within the peritoneal cavity, or in stage 4. Because the patients become symptomatic in stage 3 and stage 4. Early stages, they are not symptomatic. So they don't come forward for that of the checkup. So it's very important for us to diagnose them early. So that can be done at the time of the annual health check. And in that also, simple clinical evaluation and the ultrasound and transvaginal ultrasound specifically with that of the colored Doppler can really pick up any of the ovarian mass at the time when it is very much limited to that of the ovary, along with the combination of the CA-125, which is one of the tumor marker. We can pick up the ovarian cancer, but cannot be taken as that of the screening. Screening means every normal woman. So we focus our attention for the ovarian cancer screening for those patients, those who are at increased risk of developing ovarian cancer. I think you are aware of increasing incidence of the familial cancers these days. So any patient who has the family history of cancer, either in first degree relatives or in second degree relative, is at increased risk for developing cancer. So strategically, we focus our attention to these women who have the family history of the gynecological cancers, not only gynecological cancers, but the cancers even among the men within the family. I mean to say, any males who have suffered with that of the colon cancers, pancreatic cancer, or prostate cancer can also increase the risk of the ovarian cancer, uterine cancer in the female. So I think that's how we have to actually strategically plan what kind of the screening we can offer to the women. how frequently we can offer, and because screening cannot be done in every month. Body changes every month, right? But our aim is to do the test at the time when we are likely to pick up the maximum number of the women having the abnormal, or we can say the very early cancers.
Got it. Very helpful, ma'am. So what you're saying is the transvaginal ultrasound as well as CA-125. We are seeing a lot of corporates add that for their employees lately in the annual health checks. That
Sure.
helps. Along with strategic screening if you have family history, not just of the same gynecological cancers, but even in male family members, any cancer history.
Sure.
Very, very helpful. And ma'am, at what age should the screening, in terms of, not the strategic one, but the general screening as you were mentioning, what age is right to do this screening?
Most common screening is for the cervical cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look into the guidelines, what does the FOXI recommend, and also the American Society of Gynecologists recommend? So American Cancer Society recommends. So we should start screening around, say, the age of, what recommendation is 25 years for cervical cancer in our country. But those who have been sexually active for minimum 2 years, that's how we advise them. Otherwise, every woman who is around 30 years of the age must go for the screening for cervical cancer with the help of the PEP test and also the HPV DNA testing.
And how frequently, ma'am?
Yeah, it can be repeated between 3 to 5 years, depending
it.
on the risk factors.
Great, very clear. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Joshi, now just moving on to the symptoms and treatment aspect of it. You mentioned that a lot of these gynecological cancers are not symptomatic until a later stage, and hence, more difficult to diagnose early. But are there common symptoms that you've still seen people walk with that can be managed then?
So actually, this cannot be generalized to all the gynecological cancers, I would say, especially cervical cancer and uterine cancer. These are the two cancers who give some kind of the signs. We take it as signs because there is not much of the discomfort to the woman. There can be irregularity in the periods, those who are in the reproductive age group, those who are having the regular menstruation. When they find that there is excessive bleeding, they are passing clots. And also there is in between the periods, there is some kind of spotting is there or irregular bleeding is there. So it is the irregular bleeding or the excessive bleeding, and those women who are postmenopausal, there is postmenopausal bleeding or maybe the blood-stained discharge or even the spotting. These are very, very important signs to be noted. Other than this, any woman who is having very early cervical cancer, she can have only one sign, that is the postcoital spotting or the bleeding. She may not have any other kind of the irregular bleeding, but any irregular bleeding or any abnormal bleeding should always be evaluated well, where we have to exclude that there should not be any cancer there. That is important because these signs can be in the conditions other than the malignancy or other than the cancers as well. But we should not ignore if we have these signs and the symptoms.
Makes sense.
These are very early ones. Patient doesn't have any kind of the pain or discomfort. That's how they should be looking for these signs or the symptoms.
Got it. Great. Dr. Joshi, we are beginning to get some questions. I have a queue from my team on the symptoms itself, so I'll start picking those and we'll go to the next segment post that. The first one is on uterine fibroids. Is that a precursor to cancer or is that a risk factor?
I think uterine fibroid is a benign tumor of the uterus. That is the smooth muscle tumor of the uterus. This is benign, means it's not malignant. There have been some case reports where actually you can say the transition from this benign to malignant have been reported, but in general, it has not been accepted well. On the other side, I think I would like to tell you this, that the sarcoma, which is the malignancy of the uterus, also presents exactly in the same way as that of the fibroid. So I think we have to be very careful in assessing these patients of the fibroid, if it is fast growing, or if the symptoms like that of the irregular bleeding or the excessive bleeding is very much there, I think there we should really think that this may not be fibroid, this may be some other malignant tumor of the uterus, which is highly malignant.
Okay. So fibroids standalone are benign, but you're
Yes.
saying they have similar presentation as
Yes.
malignant tumors, so must be assessed carefully. Great.
Yeah, very much.
So I'll just check on the other questions. Another question that we're getting, Dr. Joshi, is does starting sexual activity at a younger age pose a risk for gynecological cancers?
Yes. Early sexual activity at a younger age, that increases the incidence of cervical cancer. So I think it has been proved very well. So I think one should really be careful when to start the sexual activity.
Got it. Great. So moving on to the next segment, and we'll keep taking questions, Dr. Joshi. Thank you so much for that. Is on the treatment itself, right? So if someone has, say, you mentioned irregular bleeding or post-coital bleeding, something which is not normal and a symptom, right? Or they have family history and they're suspecting something. Which type of doctor should they first walk to?
I think when anyone has the suspicion of the gynecological cancers, then I think they should see the specialist, and I would recommend they should go to the gynec oncologist first.
Got it. And then what are the treatment options of these various cancers? And if you could also touch upon robotic surgery as an option of treatment.
Yeah. So the treatment depends on the stage at the time of the diagnosis. When the disease is limited to that particular organ, or there is a spread of the disease or not. That's how the cancer is different from that of the benign. Because once the cancer initiates at one place, say for an example, the uterus, that is the lining of the uterus is endometrial. So we call it as endometrial cancer as well. So once the endometrial cancer is confined to the uterus, that means it is uterus confined disease. And that's how when the patient comes to us, we first diagnose. And the diagnosis is very, very important. That can be done only on the biopsy, but that's not true for all the cancers. Like that of the ovarian cancers, the patient can present with that of the complex ovarian mass, but we require to establish the diagnosis on histology, and for that we actually take the help of the frozen section, that on evaluation on table we remove the tumor intact if there is no spread of the tumor. So we come to know what is the type of this tumor is. Our pathologist on frozen section tells us whether it is benign or it is malignant or it is borderline cancer. And accordingly, we have to stage them. So based on the stage, of course, we decide the treatment line. Initially, when the tumor is spread to the different parts in the sense that is known as the metastasis, it can go to the lungs, it can go to the liver, also maybe the bones or maybe the brain. So I think that's how we have to evaluate the patient. Once it is confined to that particular organ, majority of these cancers can really be having a very good prognosis with the surgical management. The surgery remains the standard goal, or is the standard treatment for the organ specific or organ confined disease. But the surgery is different in the sense that we have to surgically stage these patients. We have to actually address the lymph nodes. We have to address the various peritoneal surfaces. We have to address the nearby tissues as well. So that finally we can know what is the stage, so that we can decide any kind of the treatment other than that of the surgery will require to be given to that patient, like radiation therapy, like chemotherapy. Now we have the immunotherapy and also the targeted therapies, looking into how best we can manage them. So far as the robotic surgery is concerned, I think I would say that this is the recent advancement in the surgical management of the gynecological cancers. And this is a surgery with that of the precision. There is minimum blood loss. And also the outcome of the surgical outcome is really very much impressive, because majority of the patients, they don't have the pain. You can say the painkillers they don't have to take for longer time, maybe 2-3 days, and that's how they move out of the hospital the very next day, maybe in the morning or in the evening, and they start their meals right the very next day morning. So I think the perioperative outcome of these surgeries, especially the robot-assisted surgery, is very much impressive. This is very much acceptable by the patients, and they want to opt for it because it gives them the good quality of life, right? They are very much afraid of such an extensive surgery can be done by the robot-assisted. And imagine the patient going home the very next day.
Wow.
And when indicated that they have to take the other treatment like that of the radiation and chemotherapy, that also can be taken comparatively, you can say, earlier, because their recovery is good. So I think it's a breakthrough, I would say, in the surgical management of the patients for gynecological cancers. But we have to select when to do robotic surgery, when not to do robotic surgery. Of course, we have to follow all oncological principles in order to give the best outcome to our patients.
Got it.
And especially here, I would like to mention that uterine cancers, as I said, that these are obese women with diabetes and hypertension. And I remember my days at the time when we used to do, a lot of open surgeries. We used to really run for the abdominal dressing of the wound. There used to be a lot of wound complications because you really cannot avoid. It's a concern about the diabetes as well as the obesity. So I think those were the days. But now, for last almost 11 years, I would say, very, very happy to see all such patients actually moving out of the hospital the very next day. And we have not seen any of such complications at all.
That's quite amazing and surprising, actually.
And naturally, and I think overall the oncological outcome as well as the perioperative outcome is far better with that of the robot-assisted surgery.
And I'm curious, Dr. Joshi, you're seeing insurance cover the robotic surgeries as well?
Yeah, I think earlier insurance was not covering it, but yes, now insurance is covering it. I think insurance also requires to understand that giving the good quality of
preventing
life to our patients,
rehospitalizations, yes,
that is also comparatively much, much less. We don't have to transfuse the blood in majority of our patients.
So the stay in the hospital is lesser, rehospitalization rate is lesser, quality of life is better,
Sure.
life expectancy is higher, you're
Yes.
saying. Great. So then a pointer for our audience, when they buy insurance, they should also look at inclusions, exclusions of robotic
I think
surgery.
ideally the insurance should not actually say no to it.
But man, there are always inclusions and exclusions that then, you must study before buying a policy. So
But we are seeing the changes in that. And based on whatever the law, I think they have been rather accepting the robot-assisted surgery for these patients. Sometimes they ask that why robotic surgery. I think that will also go away over the time because majority of the women are going to opt for it.
got it. Great, Dr. Joshi. Thank you so much. That was so insightful and so heartwarming to understand that, how much you care about the end outcome for your patient and how you're celebrating the advances in technology that is helping you keep your patient healthier. That's really great. So, Dr. Joshi, we'll now address the elephant in the room, which a lot of our women audience would be thinking about, that, gynecological cancer diagnosis is not an easy one, especially for a woman, given it has impact, as you rightly said, on fertility, ability to conceive and, have children. So, I wanted to understand from you, can fertility be preserved in uterine or cervical cancer and to what extent?
Yes, I think it's very, very important aspect which you are really touching on. We have a lot of experience, if I can share that with you, of preserving the fertility. But that can be done only when the disease is confined to that particular organ. Say, for an example, the patient is having the ovarian cancer. In ovarian cancer, it is limited to that of the ovary. We can definitely preserve the fertility. We can preserve the uterus and the opposite ovary if it is normal. And these are the women who can have the normal pregnancy later on. And germ cell tumor is the kind of the tumor of the ovary, which is usually diagnosed in the very young girls. And we have large experience of actually treating these patients with that of the surgery, where we can preserve the fertility. And even after getting the chemotherapy, they have conceived. Also, there's stromal tumors of the ovary. Also, cervical cancer. When the cervical cancer is very early, it's a very small lesion, we can go for the radical trachelectomy or maybe the trachelectomy if it is very, very early. And we can preserve the uterine function in these patients. I think we have done in some, and patients have conceived later on. Uterine cancer becomes a challenge as we are seeing more and more such patients in the very early, you can say, or in the younger age group. In select group of the patients, we can definitely preserve the fertility in these patients also, but we always have to see what is the nature of this particular cancer of the endometrium. Whether it is more aggressive, of course, we cannot do that. So we have to look into many aspects before that, but yes, it is possible, it's feasible. And it's very much, I think, successful and doesn't impact onto the oncological outcome of the patient.
Makes sense. Great, Dr. Joshi. While we are on the topic of fertility, I have a queue for questions from the audience again. And the first one is related to fertility. So IVF treatments or procedures like egg retrieval or embryo freezing, do they have a correlation with risk of gynecological cancers?
This is very much controversial. There had been some reports initially that I think more and more number of, you can say, the induced cycles on the IVF. There was report of increasing incidence of the ovarian cancer, especially of that of the borderline ovarian cancer. But I think the other reports following this that negativate. And we don't see any definite correlation of the, you can say, the ovulation inductions for the IVF with that of the ovarian cancer. But we have to be little vigilant and on follow-up, as we are doing in all the women. We are taking these situations with a slight increased risk. So annual, actually, the screening definitely is very much recommended. And especially if they have the family history, then of course that increases the risk.
Got it. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. We'll take one more, and this is basically related to C-sections. Is it true that multiple C-sections can cause such cancers?
No, I don't think so. It's true.
Great. Thanks for busting myths again, Dr. Joshi. Great. So now we'll talk about the preventive aspects. We've spoken about risk factors, screening, treatment, fertility preservation. What about vaccinations, Dr. Joshi? You spoke about HPV vaccine earlier. What really is HPV vaccine? Which cancers does it prevent, and to what extent?
I think it's a very, very important question, I would say. HPV vaccine is the vaccine which prevents the infection of HPV virus, especially oncogenic virus, HPV 16, HPV 18. Of course, we have different types of the HPV vaccine, and they are effective against those particular strains of the HPV. Like we have the bivalent vaccine, which prevents these HPV 16 and 18, as these are the two viruses which are rather the risk factor for majority of the cervical cancers. Other than this, we have quadrivalent vaccine, which also includes, the condyloma. So that also HPV, in addition to HPV 16 and 18, that also covers up the condylomatous HPV virus. Now we have the nanovalent vaccine. Now that is having the 9 strains of the vaccine. But of course, the efficacy is quite similar so far as the cervical cancer is concerned. So that's how the HPV can prevent, and it's near 100%.
Amazing.
Prevention. It's important when you are giving this vaccine.
I wanted to ask that.
Yeah. So when you are giving this vaccine below the age of 15 years, I think the efficacy is very good. And of course, the number of doses given for this prevention of cervical cancer, these are just 2. In rest of the women, I think we will have to go for the 3 doses instead of 2. So the women who are up to 27 years, I think this was the first of its randomized trial which had shown that the women included were up to 27 years. That's how we are accepting the women up to 27 years. They will have a good protection against the cervical cancer with the use of the HPV vaccine. But the women who are more than 27 years of the age, that again becomes little controversial. Why so? Because the protection, I think, that reduces with the increasing age. So it's recommended that the women who are above 27 years of the age, but less than 45 years of the age, they can take the HPV vaccine, but under the supervision of the doctor or the gynecologist, I would say, because here the woman has already exposed to the HPV. So this vaccination will not be that effective. So I think it's always better to make them understand that there is a reduction in the risk by the use of the HPV vaccine. But it is not to the extent as we see in the women who take the vaccine before any sexual exposure.
Got it. And ma'am, touching on that aspect for people, women say, even above 27 years, does it matter if a woman has a single or multiple sexual partners and the risk thereof and the benefit of such an HPV vaccine?
So I think it's a very, very important issue. People think that they have taken the HPV vaccine, so they have got 100% protection. No. The other risk factors, as you mentioned, these are the multiple partners, sexual partners, and also the smoking. Also, the situations like that of the HIV, any kind of the situation which has reduced the immunity. These are all the risk factors for increasing the incidence of cervical cancer. So despite of taking rather the HPV vaccine, it is recommended that everyone is supposed to go, or every woman supposed to go for the regular screening, so that we can really pick it up in its precancerous stage. We can really treat the precancerous stage and we can prevent cervical cancer.
And Dr. Joshi, given we have seen a lot of our clients also administer HPV vaccines for their women colleagues in their offices, what is usually the frequency of the 2 or 3 doses that you mentioned?
Yeah, usually it depends on the type of the vaccine which you are selecting. If it is bivalent, naturally it is around, say, 0, 1 and 6 months. And if it is quadrivalent, that is 0, 2 and 6 months. That's how we can actually, this is the interval which we usually follow.
And I know this is a topic related to women gynae cancers, but I will still ask you a question. That is HPV vaccine indicated for men? And say, example, in a corporate, if a senior leader is wanting to vaccinate their employees, is it only for females or also for males?
I think it's a very, very interesting question. The West is, I think, looking into it, and they have already introduced, this HPV vaccine for the men as well. And in India, we do not have such, actually, neither the guidelines for the introduction of the HPV vaccine for the men. But definitely, I think the introduction of the HPV vaccine for the men is going to make an impact. Because it's not only the women who are going to suffer. I think we do have the other incidences of the other cancers which are also important. And that's important with that, and that is also correlated well with that of the sexual practices. So the men have also been actually advised and recommended that they should take the HPV vaccine.
Until similar age, 27 years?
Yeah, I think it's always before the exposure of any kind of the sexual activity.
Got it. Great. Very, very interesting facts, ma'am. Thanks so much for sharing. Now, just talking about family history, Dr. Joshi, which you touched upon earlier, that we have to strategically screen an individual if they have family history, not just of gynae cancers, but any type of cancer in their family. So how important is family history, and which type of cancers have the highest correlation?
I think when we are looking at the gynecological cancers, any woman who is suffering with that of the uterine cancer or the ovarian cancer, these are the two cancers which I think have very good correlation with that of the family history. In uterine cancer, most of the time it's a Lynch syndrome, right? So now in Lynch syndrome, if suppose any of the women who is suffering with the uterine cancer and she has been rather found positive for that of the Lynch syndrome, these are the genetic mutations which can be detected on the Lynch syndrome. You can say the test, Lynch test, that genetic test, so that we know that yes, this woman has the you can say the increased risk for the other cancers as well. In Lynch syndrome, it can be the colonic cancer. Now, this woman, we have to actually screen her on her follow-up at regular intervals for that of the colon cancer as well. Also, I think genetic counseling plays an important role here. She has to take the genetic counseling so that any kind of the genetic mutation in her first degree or second degree relatives can definitely be addressed well, so that we can pick up any of these cancers well in time and we can treat them well. On the other side, there is the breast ovarian cancer syndrome. I think you must have heard of it. And these are so correlated. Any patient suffering with that of the breast cancer has increased incidence of the ovarian cancer. So they are likely to be on the screening actually with that of more aggressively. And also we require to know whether these are having any genetic mutation or not. So that's how BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutation you must have heard for. That is how it is the breast cancer as well as the ovarian cancer incidence is high. Not only in that woman, but also in her first or the second degree relatives as well. So with the genetic counseling, actually, we can really take good care in understanding how much is the risk and how do we have to really screen these women.
And when we say family history, Dr. Joshi, we mean parents, siblings, grandparents, up till there?
Yeah, siblings, grandparents, cousins, actually. That's how you have to also address.
Got it. So if there is such history of any type of cancer in the family, one should approach their doctor and discuss about the options of genetic counseling.
Especially there are few cancers, I think, which one should not really omit. As I mentioned to you about pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, stomach cancers, and also the prostate cancer. Any history of breast cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer. That's how these cancers can be picked up.
Not so much on the kidney cancer or blood cancers.
So I think, some of the gene mutations, whenever we have like that of the Lynch, there can be increased incidence of the renal cancers as well, but comparatively much less.
Got it.
So that is how we take the help of the genetic counselors.
Makes sense. Great. So, Dr. Joshi, now touching upon a very critical and last segment before we'll go to our audience for questions again, is lifestyle, right? It is again the big elephant in the room. You did mention that changes in lifestyle, adopting Western lifestyle or some aspects of fast food, packaged food, smoking, alcohol, that they increase the risk factors. We've already discussed those. So, what are your key takeaways or pointers for our audience, Dr. Joshi, which we could share with them, say top 3, top 5, that they can start implementing in their day-to-day routine to prevent such cancers?
So one should be in healthy weight. One should not actually gain unnecessary weight to be obese. And for that, what is important is the proper diet. And it's a balanced diet, which is important. And along with this, I think one should be really physically active. Good physical activity of 30 minutes every day, I think they should opt for. And what is important is the good sleep and, of course, the stressless life.
Stressless life is not possible, Dr. Joshi.
I know it's not possible, but one can definitely work on it to reduce the stress.
Yes.
Whichever the kind of the stress it is. Because that is indirectly affecting, this is what I feel, because I'm very much, concerned about the stress of even our patients. Those who have been diagnosed of the gynecological cancers, that if suppose we can look into how we can reduce the stress for these women, definitely that makes an impact. This is what I have observed in all my patients.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Joshi. And I think you earlier touched upon smoking and alcohol as other.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they should not smoke. They should not take the alcohol.
Now we are getting more questions, and I think a lot of questions are actually related to risk factors, given that we have a younger pool of audience probably watching this. We'll take a couple of questions, Dr. Joshi, if you don't mind. The first one is on birth control pills and if they have any impact on cancer risk.
Yes, I think birth control pills, they are protective. If suppose given for 5 years, they are protective by 50%, reduces the risk of ovarian cancer. That's the advantage. On the other side, that also reduces the risk of uterine cancers. But on the other side, I think if they are given for a little longer time, there is controversial issue, and there have been controversial reports for that of the breast cancer. So I think one has to be taking these birth control pills under the supervision. This is what is very, very important.
Got it. Great. Dr. Joshi, the next one is on usage of sanitary pads. Are there specific types of sanitary pads that can be dangerous or risk factors for cancers?
I think standard sanitary pads are not dangerous.
Okay. Great. So we will maybe take a couple more questions, and this one is linked to breast cancer actually, and on mammography. I know it was not the subject of today's conversation.
No, I think, definitely we
so
can talk
is
about
mammography helpful or has any side effects, and who all should have it done at what age?
I think mammography, there have been very mammogram is very much established in the West, right? Going for the mammogram every year, especially in those who are at increased risk of the breast cancer. And that's how it has been established well, based on the evidence. But as we practice the same and we grow, I mean to say in the practice, we come to know what are the side effects and all that. But on an average, I think the mammogram is accepted very well for the diagnosis or for the screening of the breast. And also at the time when we are planning the treatment for the breast cancer, then also it has got a role.
Got it. Great. So Dr. Joshi, we'll just take a couple more questions. This one is on uterus removal. If someone has gotten the uterus removed, can they still have these gynae cancers?
I think it depends on what was the indication of removal of uterus. If it was because of, say, some kind of the pre-invasive lesion coexisting at the time of the removal of the uterus, maybe because of the conditions of any of the uterine tumor, and the cervix shows that it is the high-grade intraepithelial lesion in the cervix. And these are the women where we should really be careful about any of the pathology coming into the vagina, and they require the regular screening. Or if it was done because of the cervical cancer itself, of course, that these are the women who require the regular screening so far as that of the uterine cancers. And sometimes we have the problem coming up in the vagina itself, that is the vaginal cancers. Of course, the incidence is much less in comparison to that of the cervical and the other cancers, also the vulvar cancer. So I think what is important, with the increasing age, the incidence of the vaginal cancer and the vulvar cancer also rise. So yearly checkup of the woman, that really makes sense.
Got it. And Dr. Joshi, is missing periods a risk factor of different types of cancers?
Again, I think if you look at the PCOS, how does it work? I think, as I mentioned, that one is likely to miss the period. Missing the period means there is overgrowth of the endometrium. And that could be because of the increased, the exposure of the estrogen hormone. As with the ovulation, there is production of the progesterone, which is lacking now. So in the PCOS, there is no ovulation, so there is no progesterone. And the woman or the girl is really exposed to only estrogen, and that can give rise to the uterine cancer or the endometrial cancer. That's how we are looking at.
Great. And Dr. Joshi, we'll just take one last question, and this one is on hormone replacement therapy. Does that also have side effects or causes any risk?
Yes, I think hormone replacement therapy, this was used in the West much earlier with only the estrogen. And they could find out that yes, the uterine cancer incidence is on the rise. And it was a very wise observation, and that's how they added, the progesterone to it. So addition of the only, you can say, the estrogen after the menopause. Hormone replacement therapy means one has already achieved the menopause. After that, the woman is taking the hormones as a part of the replacement in order to have the estrogenic function. So estrogen should not be actually administered alone, always under the you can say supervision, and that too in combination with that of the progesterone, so that we can reduce the risk of any of these gynecological cancers. But it should not be taken for a very, very long time. Usually we decide when to give and not to give. There are some situations where it is contraindicated. Of course, we don't give them the HRT. So I think that's how, under the supervision, one can decide, and also the duration and the dosage and the type of the hormones being used for.
Great. Thank you so much. And amazing question from the audience too. Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi, for being with us on Conversations with Xyla today. It is really our pleasure to be hosting senior doctors like you to get the real insights and the right information disseminated to our audience. To our amazing audience, thank you for joining us today. We will see you again on the next episode of Conversations with Xyla. Till then, have a great day and take care. Thank you. Signing off.